Welcome back to Theater Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Stephanie Vella to discuss Antonin Artaud's Oceanic Cruelties, Eroding Anthropological Certainty in Two Performances from 1933 to 1934. This article is out in our June 2026 issue. That's volume 78, issue number 2. Hi, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for having me.
So, I'm really excited to have the chance to talk a little bit about your forthcoming article for Theater Journal. To start us off, could you give me a brief summary of the topic of your article and your main argument in it?
Sure. So, from April 1933 to January 1934, the French avant-garde, ex-surrealist theater artist and theorist Antonin Artaud wrote and performed some version of two texts, The Theater and the Plague and a scenario called The Conquest of Mexico. Both were staged in Paris in non-theater venues that were chosen by Artaud because they would have their authority directly undermined by his content and staging. So, a medical and academic setting to enact an uncontrolled plague body, and an event for potential donors made rich by colonialism to attack colonialist ideologies. Um, Contrary to popular theater history truisms that you may have heard that contend that Artaud never realized his theater of cruelty, I argue that these performances were some of its clearest and fullest realizations. So both texts describe historical disasters that arrived by ship, the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 and the arrival of Hernán Cortés on the shores of Mexico in 1519. These two oceanic performance texts also reveal the entanglements of disability, race, and primitivism in late imperial France. Artaud, as a person living with disabilities, called attention to these entanglements through strategically staging his own body, utilizing a methodology I call non-anthropological primitivism to disrupt historical certainties with more conjectural imaginaries.
That all sounds really interesting. How did you come to this topic? I mean, I'm always interested in projects that sort of seek to challenge those received theater history truisms, but in this particular case, like what led you to make this discovery that Artaud was doing more or has succeeded more with these productions than has been thought in the past?
So, I think there are probably really long answers to this question and short answers. I will say just briefly that I have been fascinated by Artaud and his writing since I was in my late teens. And I think, initially for me, working through his completely disorienting texts created like some kind of really important bridge for me between like my two primary adolescent interests in theater and punk rock. And I think in many ways you could trace like a whole genealogy from that to this article, but we can spare narrating that longer trajectory and speak more recently. And this article grew out of re-encountering Artaud through the methodology I've been developing over the past few years for understanding acts of cultural and historical displacement and collage in performance, particularly in the 20th century, which includes often fraught and destabilizing displacements like primitivism. And so just to give maybe a more well-known example, like a brief example of what I mean by displacement, I mean something like how a Ojibwa totem and Polynesian taboos could be displaced, circulated, and recombined in Viennese psychoanalysis. I'm interested in how that happens and why it happens. So this methodology I'm using to understand these displacements does two things. The first involves asking, what is the actual source for the time, place, practice, image, whatever the thing is being displaced? What's its source? What material conditions facilitated its movement, its moving out of place, out of time? And which parts of the displaced thing are kept, which are erased, which are altered, which are fabulated? And then secondly, which is, what I emphasize more heavily in this article, is to ask who is doing the displacing, what material conditions surrounded them, what is their embodied experience within them, and how might that relate to the thing being displaced. Um, so in the case of Artaud, this methodology involved, in part, returning to the first thing I ever read by him, the book The Theater and Its Double, which was published in 1938, but which collects writings that Artaud wrote and published throughout the 1930s. The chapters in the book aren't arranged chronologically in the order they were written. So I essentially took the chapters along with other published and unpublished texts that Artaud wrote in the 1930s, and I reordered them on a timeline of historical events and events in Artaud's life. And then I reread them that way to see what, if anything, connected differently. And when I did that, the theater and the plague and the conquest of Mexico ended up near to one another. And I noticed strong resonances between the two texts. They both depicted ships bringing disasters. They both have prophecies about these disasters that some figures recognize and some do not. They both have miasmas, to name just a few of the things I noticed. And then I also realized that he had staged a version of both these texts in particularly confrontational settings a few months apart. So to return to the methodology I was just describing, I asked, what were the material conditions surrounding the writing and performing of these two texts in Paris in 1933? What was Artaud's lived embodied experience like in relation to those material conditions, specifically his lived experience as a disabled person, a formerly institutionalized person, and how might those things connect to the 16th century conquest of Mexico and the 18th century plague of Marseille? Why was this person displacing these things at this time and this way, and what conjectural imaginaries might these displacements create? And it's through those questions and the connections that I found through them, along with the imagery of the texts themselves, that I came to the idea of the oceanic and a mode of analysis for understanding this work and Artaud in a new way.
Thank you. That's so much of what you've said is really resonating with things that I'm thinking about from. So I work mostly, as I think you know, on Chinese theater, but especially in this early to mid 20th century moment, there's
Mhm.
also a lot of what we could categorize as displacement in terms of how objects and gestures and ideas are moving, sometimes text to from
Yeah.
Asia, broadly writ,
Mhm.
to European modernists. So I really appreciate your work trying to think through that in a new way that helps us to understand really like the material conditions of the making of
Mm.
these ideas and forms. And of course, that's already sort of gesturing towards my next question, which is how this all connects to your broader research. But maybe you have some other examples you'd like to offer, or also would love to invite you to think about how this particular article and also this broader idea, this theory that this methodology that you're working on can connect to other trends or ideas in theater and performance
Mm.
studies more broadly writ.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this does really come out of a desire to think through what are often really ethically fraught moments in theater history. And displacement is a very neutral term for something that's often not particularly neutral. It's often something that can be theft, it can be appropriation, it can be pillage, it can be fabrication. But it also is something that I think, because it is so fraught and loaded, is of intense interest to artists working in the avant-garde in the 20th century. And also because of that, I think it can be challenging for scholars to unravel it, and to actually think through the reasons why it might have been happening and to understand the meaning. I mean, I think that what also happens when you start pulling on these connections is that you end up with um, very unusual bibliographies and unusual series of connections between things that can push on disciplinary borders. And I think it can feel unsettling sometimes in scholarship to read something that has a unusual bibliography. I mean, I think my article has an unexpected bibliography for reading Artaud in many ways. And I think, that for me at least, that is part of how one goes about working through this material. But to connect it to my larger project and my larger book project, which this is from, which right now is called Primitivism, Embodiment, Performance Research Methodologies in Colonial Modernity. I look at artists, scholars, and people who often blur those two categories who, from about the late 19th century through the Cold War, experimented with methodologies that engaged with or utilized embodied practice in ways that intentionally displaced and collaged histories, places, cultures. And these proto or early performance studies practices, as I'm calling them, were shaped by both the time periods, global expansions of colonialism and capitalism, and then relatedly, the simultaneous explosion of the aesthetics of primitivism. Primitivism as a term typically describes an aesthetic appropriation of people, places, things that feel subjectively to be prior to or outside of modernity. It's an incredibly loaded term. It has been reassessed in recent years, particularly by a scholar named Ben Etherington, and positioned more materially as an aesthetic response to the height of European imperialism and what was increasingly experienced by a variety of people in a variety of places as an all-pervasive global system. Um, this complexification of the term doesn't really mitigate the essentialisms or appropriations or bigotries associated with primitivism. As I was getting at, primitivism is an inflammatory term that sometimes describes an inflammatory, but at least intentionally provocative aesthetic. That's why people used it in the colonies and in the metropole. And I use the term in my book and in this article rather than some less jarring euphemism, because I want to explore its potentials and its history without obscuring the potential for violence and injustice that's contained within it. And so in the scholar artists I'm writing about, I'm particularly interested in how they displace and collage times and places in ways that resist or undermine anthropological or historical certainty or mastery, and instead engage in what I'm calling, with gratitude to Hershini Bana Young, a non-anthropological affinity and resonance. Um, so the primitivist aesthetics I'm theorizing are less ones where a culture or practice is appropriated with a sense of ownership or explicated with a seeming objective authority, but rather one where the borders of times, places, people become fuzzy and more speculative associations, affiliations, resonances can be created. Um, and I'm arguing that this non-anthropological primitivism is a key structuring mechanism and the root of many of the tensions and potentials in the field we now call performance studies. So in addition to Artaud, the book also has research on the British classicist Jane Ellen Harrison, the German art historian Abby Warburg, the US anthropologist, writer, theater artist Zora Neale Hurston, and then the US theater artist and scholar of performance studies Richard Schechner.
I'm really interested in that last one. Um, I'm thinking too, as you're discussing the broader project, that how really useful this will be for teaching, because I think something that many of us have struggled with in the classroom, even with figures like Bertolt Brecht, like how do you deal with the many layers and how, without ignoring the difficulty and yet also without dismissing the work because of the difficulty. And so I'm anticipating that your piece and your broader book project also will be really useful for teaching, but at the same time you're engaging with some really theoretically complex ideas which can be harder to digest, especially when first introduced at the undergrad level. So something I like to ask all of my authors is, if you had to summarize a few key takeaways, especially for an undergraduate or a non-specialist reader, what are you hoping folks who read your article will come away from it with?
Yeah, I think that in part, having taught Artaud myself, I know that it can be challenging for students at any level, to find a way into and through and maybe even back out of his texts. And I hope that this article can help someone see the writing positioned historically and materially in the time it was written, and the economic and political conditions that it was written in, and in Artaud's own experiences of his body and the world. Um, at the same time, I think I would encourage anyone reading Artaud, and I hope my article invites you to do this as well, is to allow yourself to follow the kind of strange, unsettling associative trails that you might find inside of Artaud's texts. Artaud is someone that wants to disorient us. He wants to erode boundaries between times, places, people, bodies. And so part of engaging with his aesthetic, part of what I'm doing, and part of what I hope readers of my article and readers of Artaud can do is to kind of allow themselves to swim in that boundaryless sea, to see what associations and affinities you might find there. Um, and to be willing to find associations and affinities that seem like they're wrong, right? That seem like they're from the wrong geographical area, the wrong time period, or the wrong kind of academic discipline. Because I think that those affinities are part of how he is creating his work. It's part of his aesthetic, but it's also a methodology I think he developed that you can try yourself if you're brave enough.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, unless you have anything else you'd like to share with or encourage our viewers to do.
No, please read my article. I'm looking forward to sharing it with everyone.
Yes. So for everyone who's watching, please go read the article, especially its bibliography. I hear it's great. The article is, I'm here today with Stephanie Vella, and her article is Antonin Artaud's Oceanic Cruelties, Eroding Anthropological Certainty in Two Performances from 1933 to 1934. And that's out in Theater Journal, Volume 78, Issue 2. That's our June 2026 issue. Thank you again so much, Stephanie, for taking the time to talk today and share so much fascinating information about your article with our viewers.
Thanks, Taryn.